Okay, well, I think I'll start because if people are coming in, they'll just miss me doing the introduction. So I'm sure they'll be able to live without that. So we'll just get going. So welcome to everybody. Lovely to have you here at this particular webinar. In case you've been to other ones and you're thinking that's not Catherine Ross. Indeed, I'm not Catherine Ross. I'm Harriet Carty from Caring for God's Acre. And Caring for God's Acre have been commissioned by the Church of England Environmental Programme to support them in their work on land and nature. And I'm really delighted that one of the first jobs that we've been given under that contract is to deliver these webinars, which is great fun for us. So I'm really delighted to be hosting today. And although Catherine Ross isn't here, her beautiful slides are on this lovely image that she's got with kind permission from Nat Morley, which I think really does sum up a lot of the problems that we're facing and perhaps how we're feeling about things. As you know, this is part of Churches Count on Nature 2023. This is the third year that we've run Churches Count on Nature. It's a partnership between ourselves, Caring for God's Acre, the Church of England, the Church in Wales, and also a Rocha, Christian charity who run Eco Church, which I'm sure many of you will be involved in. The other sort of main element that Churches Count on Nature does is encouraging people to do an event involving wildlife recording during Love Your Burial Ground Week, which is taking place at the moment. And we've got a lovely number of people running events all over the place. If you're on social media, you'll see things flying in, all sorts of fun things happening. We had 345 registrations. Many of these people are running more than one event. So I think it's going to be a real bumper year in terms of activities. Liam. So far, you've all been introducing yourselves in the chat. That's been lovely. But going forward, could you try and forget about the chat and use the question and answer button, which is just next door to the chat, if you'd like to ask questions. That also gives the opportunity of voting for the questions. If somebody asks something that you were going to put or you're particularly interested in, you can just click on that, which brings it higher up the order and will mean that perhaps we'll have more time to focus on it. Other than that, I think the key thing to tell you is that we will send you an email with any links or web pages, that sort of thing, anything like that that's mentioned today. Liam and I, my colleague, will furiously scribble them down. And so we will send those out. So don't feel that you need to be trying to capture them yourselves during this webinar. You can just listen and enjoy. Also, a recording is being made of the webinar, and that will become available to yourselves and will go onto the Church of England website, which also means that if you're unlucky enough to miss my colleague Andrea's webinar yesterday, you'll be able to see that on the website and catch up with that one. Sorry about the phone ringing, it's getting answered now. There we go. So just a quick one on the upcoming webinars. There's the rest of this series. We've got 3 more after today, Wednesday, Thursdays and Fridays. I think they all look really interesting. So if you haven't yet booked on, I would thoroughly recommend them. And then after that, you'll see that there's a webinar on church solar panels, church heating, and then through to October, one on heat pump training. So please sign up for that, the rest of those webinars if you're able to. I'm sure they'll be very, very, very good. So I'm just going to introduce Mark Betson and then hand over to him. We're doing an unusual thing today. We haven't tried this before, so we'll see how it goes. I think it's going to go very well myself. Mark has pulled together a panel of people, and we're going to hear a little bit from each of them and then open it up to questions and discussion more generally. So it's a innovative thing that Mark's pulled together here, and we'll see how it goes. But as you'll see, Mark's been involved with Caring for God's Acre for quite a while. So he's an old friend of our charity and has really been an absolutely crucial person in helping to forward the cause of conservation within burial grounds and also working very hard for those in rural communities. So I'm now going to hand over to Mark and he can introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Harriet. It's been a real pleasure to be involved with Caring for God's Acre for a number of years and see some of the wonderful work that they do. As Harriet said, I'm Mark Betson. I work as one of the National Public Policy Advisors for the Church of England, and my work throughout the years has engaged with church land in a number of forms, from that which is at the most local level, that at the Churchyard, through to the church land that's managed at a sort of regional level with diocese, that's glebe land, and most recently, when I became National Rural Officer for the Church of England, I had the pleasure to work with the rural team from the Church Commissioners, who manages a national portfolio of land, one of which we'll be hearing from later. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know them and to understand some of the issues that they've been engaging with. So today, what we're trying to do is to give you an overview of all the different scopes of church land, from the very local, and it's great to have Reverend Jonathan with us today, who's based in Winchelsea in East Sussex, who's going to talk a bit more about his experience with working with the churchyard that he has there. And it's a beautiful churchyard. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and it was a real delight in the sunshine. And then we're also going to have the opportunity to learn a bit more about what happens at the sort of diocesan scale with diocesan land. And I'm very grateful to both Marina and Jeremy. Now, Marina is the Marina O'Connor is the director for the Apricot Centre, and she's going to talk a little bit more about their work. And they are tenants on some glebe land that's owned by the Diocese of Exeter, and Jeremy was one of the people who was instrumental in his work as a land agent in putting together the agreement that enabled the Apricot Centre to work with the Diocese of Exeter in becoming a tenant of that glebe land, and for looking at different forms of regenerative farming and engagement with communities about the work that they're doing as well. So it'd be great to hear from both of them about some of the challenges, some of the successes that they've had about organising the management of church land at that level. Firstly, though, we're going to hear from Guy Webb, who is one of the senior asset manager, with Church Commissioners rural team, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to go out with the rural team on a couple of occasions to see some of the work that the tenants on the Church Commissioners land is doing, and how the commissioners are encouraging the tenants to partake in some of the activities which enable the land to be managed for climate, land and nature. It's really interesting to get to learn some of the interesting challenges that they face and some of the opportunities that they themselves can come up with. What I'd like to do, if that's all right with all the panelists, is to give them an opportunity to speak about their particular areas of interest and expertise, and talk a little bit more about that. And then I'm going to add a couple of questions and then move on to the next one. So we've got the full scope of church land, and then I'm going to open up to the questions from all of our participants that they may have come to mind as we've been going through the discussion. It'd be really good to hear from you as well. And if there are any questions that you think, oh, wait a minute, what about this? How does that work? We hopefully will be able to answer it this afternoon. So without further ado, Guy, would you be okay to kick off and talk a little bit more about the work that the Church Commissioners do with their national portfolio?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Mark. So I'll just run through the farmland portfolio, which is made up of just over 80,000 acres and is over 94% grade 1 to 3, with a significant amount of this land being arable and high yielding grass production. The land is all tenanted, with 60% of the holdings being historic AHA tenancies and the remainder being FBTs. The farmland portfolio has all farm types, including specialist top fruit, horticulture, hops, arable livestock, and dairy. There is no viticulture or poultry. So for the management purposes, we use 2 agents to manage the portfolio, and I'll now go on to discuss how sustainability has become a particular focus for the management of the portfolio. I'm going to focus on the farmland portfolio, but it is also worth remembering that within the Church Commissioners, we also have a significant timberland portfolio with woodland in America, Australia and UK, and there is also a significant strategic land portfolio. So next slide, please. So I'll discuss how we manage church land for both climate and nature. So this is just a general overview. So firstly, we employed a new environmental asset manager earlier this year in February. who is Robbie Brett, who focuses on all environmental matters, whether it's tenant liaison, new farm business tenancies, and stakeholder engagement. And there are two public-facing documents which I'd like you to draw your attention to. The first is the approach to sustainability, which is being produced later this summer, and this document will showcase the sustainability work taking place across the whole of the real assets portfolio. And the second is the stewardship report, which is produced in autumn and shows how the fund is engaged with sustainability. When these documents become public, they will show the strong sustainability credentials of the farmland portfolio. So, as mentioned, due to the scale of the portfolio, we use agents who, we ensure our agents are upskilled and understand that sustainability must be embedded in everyday decisions. So we hosted an Agents Day last autumn, which Mark joined for, which focused on our sustainability approach. And we also teamed up with a tenant who demonstrated how sustainable farming can take place in the fens and the use of renewable energy. So during the day, we presented to our agents alongside Paul Jaffe, our head of sustainability for real estate. And through these presentations, we were demonstrating to our agents how we recognise the desire for real world change and the focus on sustainability being embedded into all decisions. It is worth noting that we completed a natural capital audit last year, which showed what the farmland portfolio emissions were and provided a snapshot of our natural capital assets. And now we're building on this data to obtain primary data from our tenants. And this work is being led by Robbie, our environmental asset manager. We are collecting this data through a collaborative approach with our tenants and utilising the data they already have. So next slide, please. So tenant engagement and collaboration is key to ensuring that the Church Commissioners' land can be managed sustainably as possible. Therefore, we have worked on tenant and landlord relationship with us as asset managers conducting several non-agenda meetings to understand what environmental schemes tenants are in, their concerns, and what us as landlord can do to improve their on-farm sustainability. These meetings have been incredibly positive, and we have learned a huge amount from our tenants. There's a huge number of positive projects happening, and we have showcased some of these through our In Conversation with piece, which is published on LinkedIn, and links I can share after the presentation. Beyond these non-agenda meetings, we are undergoing a series of tenant workshops, which began last month with the Fenland Soil Workshop. And we are corporate sponsors of Fenland Soil Group and exploring the future of lowland peat and how through sustainable farming, peat preservation can be achieved. The next workshop is going to be hosted for our Rochester estate tenants who farm on the Hoo Peninsula, and this will be looking at how environment and conventional farming can work together to improve the environment whilst continuing with food production. So we're going to host this at Elmley Reserve, and we'll be exploring how we, our tenants, the RSBP and other stakeholders can work together to improve the salt marshes on the Hoo Peninsula whilst farming sustainably. And then the final sort of tenant engagement and work we've got coming up is the fact that we're inviting several tenants who farm locally towards Groundswell, which is in Hertfordshire, which is a regenerative agricultural festival. And this will allow knowledge sharing between our various tenants and we can then recognise farmer to farmer learning is the best way to share best practices. Brilliant. Next slide, please. So alongside our collaborative approach with our existing tenants, we are also ensuring that our new lettings have environmental considerations. So firstly, we've altered our modern farm business tenancies to take into account on the environmental improvements we require on the holdings. This is through soil assessment clauses, special conditions within FBTs, hedgerow cutting suggestions, and other bespoke elements. We have also started completing pre-letting environmental assessments, known as pleas of holdings, where environmental improvements can be outlined. And this might include the farm pond creation and woodland creation. And the first plea will be completed this year, and it will provide an opportunity to identify real-world environmental improvements. Finally, we have developed several specific holdings with a focus on environmental improvements. These are sites which hold specific and important environmental value, and we've selected the tenants who have an environmental focus. One such example is Bartonshire Meadows in Hereford, which is in the centre of Hereford and offers a site for specific and impressive environmental improvements. It's included an area of arable reversion to floodland meadows, orchard creation, and we're also extending public access. So therefore, new lettings allow us to bring in tenants who can undertake the environmental improvements required. Next slide, please. Alongside our tenants, we also recognise that external stakeholders play an important role in managing our land for climate and nature. And we recognise that improving the sustainability of the portfolio involves bringing in the relevant experts when required, as they can provide knowledge, potential funding, and collaborative approach. So we are corporate members of the Blue Recovery Leaders Group, which is part of the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, and we are involving them in specific projects when required, looking at how we can improve salt marshes, river quality, and wetland creation for nutrient neutrality. We are also sponsored the Fenland Soil Group, which, as mentioned, has enabled us to host a workshop for our tenants, and we will continue to work with them on improving peat degradation in the fens. We have got several specific initiatives within the farmland portfolio where we are looking at working with our tenants and local stakeholders to improve river conditions at the River Keldew in Carlisle, the River Clyst in Exeter, and we are active members of the Chichester Coastal Resilience Working Group. To manage our land sustainably as possible, we are also involved in certain initiatives to influence policy and bring stakeholders together. So we fed into the ROC report by hosting Baroness Hot Rock at a dinner, which was convened as part of the Future Land Forum, which was set up to answer the question, how will the future of land management ensure that landlord and tenant collaboration can enable positive response to the climate and biodiversity crisis? And so this brought together various stakeholders and involved Tenant Farmers Association to understand how we can all work together for the biodiversity improvements required. Finally, we've joined SSI Major Landowners Group and aim to understand how to improve land which is tenanted and is also a SSI. And through a collaborative approach, we aim to instigate improvements to land classified as SSIs. Next slide, please. This final slide demonstrates the social changes and improvements we are making within the farmland portfolio, and I'll touch on these briefly. So the S element is equally important within the farmland portfolio, the S within the ESG, and we are using it for environmental improvements as well. So we've undertaken some hedgerow planting with a local faith group, tree planting for school children, and engagement with local groups at Hereford, whilst working with the CLUE initiative to improve welfare for migrant and on-farm workers. And there's lots more projects to come forward, and this is also demonstrates the In Conversation with Peace, which is on LinkedIn. Thank you, and I look forward to any further questions.
Many thanks, Guy. That's brilliant. Can I ask you one quick question, which is, you talked about various partnerships and people you work with, one of which those partnerships you mentioned with National Trust. I just sort of trying to describe the differences between different big national landowners. What would you describe the differences between the Church Commissioners and the National Trust are in terms of how they work, just so that people understand that they are similar but not the same?
Yeah, so I think the sort of challenges for the National Trust is the land quality is very different to ours. So our land quality is predominantly grade 1 to 3, whereas National Trust will include lots of hill land and uplands. We are also governed by the Charities Act, whereas the National Trust are governed by their own individual acts. So we have to get best value for our management practices, whereas the National Trust don't have that as a sort of either a constraint or a sort of target, essentially. But we have a good working relationship with them, and a number of the challenges are similar, such as MEES and EPC improvements for residential properties, and also they're encouraging tenants on the regenerative journey as well, and we're sort of collaborating with them on that. So there are similarities, but there are sort of some stark contrasts as well.
Thank you, Guy. Yes, and sort of putting into context as well, the purpose of the Church Commissioners is to essentially derive an income to support the Church of England in terms of its ministry and mission, and the purchase of land originally for the Church Commissioners came out of the desire to actually have an income for supporting poorer parishes, if my memory serves, is one of the sort of origins of it. So there is historical reference back to the purpose for commissioners, and that's why the assets are held and what they're used for.
Yes.
Yeah, I hope I've got that right. Oh, you can correct me.
Yeah, no, that is correct. Yep.
I'm going to move on now to Marina and Jeremy. Which one of you would like to go first? Because you're going to be talking very similar projects or relation crossover with what you're doing. Marina or Jeremy, any particular preference about which way you would like to go? In which case, I'm going to apply for Marina, please, if that's all right, if you wouldn't mind giving us an overview of the Apricot Centre and what you've been doing.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. And yes, so to put it in context, I'm the Apricot Centre is the tenant farmer of 25 acres of glebe land at Dartington, which is a small village near Totnes in South Devon. And we're farming on a small farm next door. So the farm that we are still on is called Huxham's Cross Farm, and it's 13 hectares or 34 acres, and the glebe lands are contingent to our farm. So in 2021, Jeremy will tell his part of the story. Jeremy turned up and said, would we be interested in taking on the tenancy of the glebe lands? And we said we would be delighted. And part of that deal is that we have a regular FBT for 5 years, but part of that deal was that we would measure our carbon sequestration, and that 50% of that would be given to the church, that we would enhance biodiversity and offer farm walks to other glebe land tenancies in Devon or in the Diocese of Exeter. So we were happy to agree with that, and we took the farm on 2 years ago, the small 25 acres extra. So that means we've got 60 acres now contingent to each other, which is, so we put it into organic conversion because we're registered organic, biodynamic. We use something called permaculture design, and we also use a lot of agroforestry on our existing farm. So what's interesting about our existing farm, the Huxham's Cross Farm next door, is that it's owned by a land trust, and it's got 150 investors, shareholders in the farm. And because of that, the land trust asked us to do an impact assessment on our farm after 5 years. So we did that, and basically Jeremy and the church have asked us to carry on that work on the glebe lands. So we've been doing that. So on our 25 acres of glebe lands, we are growing an expansion of what we're growing on the original farm. So the farmland is much better than the bit of land we're on already. So we're growing spring wheat, small-scale spring wheat and winter wheat. And that we work in partnership with a local bakery and a larger farm. So that wheat will go into a mill, and it will be made into flour and bread, and then we sell the flour. We're growing vegetables that we sell within a 20-mile radius via direct deliveries, community supported agriculture and a market stall and local restaurants. We also produce a lot of fruit, and we have chickens for eggs, and because of the extra land, we've now experimenting with some pastured pigs and some mob grazing of some store cattle. So we will add some meat into the mix. So we count ourselves as regenerative farmers, and what we also do is on the farm we have a well-being service for looked after and adopted children. So we do a huge amount of work with children and families in and around the farm, and so we're now expanding that into the new glebe lands, and because the children in particular like to go and see the livestock. And we do a huge amount of training. So for instance, today, that was unfortunately why I was a bit late, we're training a module for Brunel University called Global Challenges. So we've got 3 weeks of students from Brunel, and we're walking, we're explaining what we're doing and how we're doing it in a very fast way. Next week, we should have a cohort from Zambia via Brunel University. And we're also training up to about 100 people a year now in level 2, 3 and 4 in regenerative land-based systems. And that's for Devon County Council as part of their natural capital drive. So they're funding that for us. So we're using now the glebe fields as part of that training as well. So I was asked to say about the, so actually I can report a little bit on our outcomes. So I measured the carbon lift this year, and we've increased the carbon on average by 0.4% in those 25 acres or 10 hectares. So that's equivalent to 11 tonnes per carbon per hectare per year. We use the farm carbon toolkit. So that's a very good result. And we've seen an uplift in biodiversity in that we now have worms. There were no worms a couple of years ago. Now there are thousands, and an increase in bird species. So we've let the hedges grow out a little bit. So the bird species have gone up. And that little piece of land flooded regularly and we've seen no flooding since we've been there, mostly because we use deep rooting green manures. We'd like to do extra work there. We'd like to dig out some scrapes and some flood alleviation, and we'd like to put in agroforestry, but because we're on a 5-year tenancy, we need a bit more negotiation about that. But in terms of the opportunities for us, it's been amazing because we've had some much better quality land, and we've been able to use it for our training, and we'd be very happy to be involved in peer-to-peer learning with other tenants. And just to say, the last piece is obviously we took it on at the tail end of the pandemic, but what we've noticed is the local community now, because we are a kind of community-based farm, and we're quite public facing, so we do a lot of public events. A lot of local people have come forward and said, there's a little gap in that hedge, would you mind if I repair that for you? And then they're looking after it. So we haven't started planting trees on the site because of the tenancy, but what I've noticed is people are chomping at the bit to kind of be involved in this little piece of land. And we have a very active local group at the church, and a church hall right on the edge of the glebe fields. And so that's our next step, to engage with them and to see what kind of work they might like to be involved in on the farm. Yes, so I'll pass over to Jeremy now.
I'm going to pass over to Jeremy. Are you all right for carrying on and talking a bit more about how the role of the agent? And we heard Guy talking about the commissioners use agents as well. It'd be great to get your perspective on that role and the work particularly that you've done with Marina and the Apricot Centre. I don't think we can hear you at the moment, Jeremy. Not coming through yet.
Hello?
Yes, you are now.
But sorry. So yes, I'm Jeremy Smith. I'm a chartered surveyor who obviously can't use Zoom. But leading on from Guy's and Mark's point about how agents fit into this, I previously worked for the Diocese of Exeter, overseeing the management of their glebe asset. And that is under the Church of England umbrella, but it is a separate autonomous entity from the Church Commissioners. The glebe itself is an agricultural portfolio, and the income and the capital is preserved to support clergy stipends and pensions. So it has a very specific objective within the diocese. And that objective was joined by a secondary objective, as important really, but regarding the Church of England's net zero objective. And that's married beautifully with Marina, the Apricot Centre, as well as others' approach to the diocese to seek engagement and use of diocese land that was being poorly managed. So that is where I come in, as in terms of the interface and the administrative, I suppose, setup of how that agreement would work in practice, how to codify that, how to fit that within the Diocese of Exeter's glebe portfolio, which has agents to deal with the day-to-day aspects, but has a large number of stakeholders in terms of tenants, both secondary and primary stakeholders. So it's kind of understanding how this could be set up in an autonomous way to run. So we started this by setting kind of objectives at the start of the process. So what did the diocese want to achieve? What did the Apricot Centre want to achieve? We then entered into a period of collaborative design, which is often in person on site, and that proved hugely useful. The the kind of nuts and bolts of the arrangement in terms of the heads of terms were useful in flushing out issues from either side. And principal ones from the dioceses were that a kind of rent had to be paid, so a kind of market income had to be derived. They wanted to work with a partner who could both sequester carbon and also show how that could be measured. So you need to be working with a partner who could representatively show that. And then we also wanted to look at the scalability and the replicability of this. And in that, the Apricot Centre was a perfect partner because they have the educational engagement arm, which we could use the Dartington site, the 25-acre site, to set up an arrangement, which is largely a trial, it's something quite new, and then go, right, how can this be replicated across the wider Diocese of Exeter and learning shared across other dioceses? And I think that was an incredibly important point and something that was included within the obligations and the heads of terms about the Apricot Centre will kindly provide on-site education of a number of glebe tenants that are put forward each year. And it goes back to Guy's point about peer-to-peer learning. That is the key way of learning and kind of sharing that wider knowledge. So really, I'll kind of finish really with signing off how I think agents interact in this process. They act as facilitators. Mark, you kind of said it as enablers. It's trying to overcome the barriers to entry, which can be administrative, which can be kind of practical, and saying, right, well, how do we blend and compromise on respective parties' objectives? And then I think a big part I kind of wanted to set out with is that the facilitating role and sitting down with people in person and understanding that the various pressure points so that you can manage some of these competitive tensions that can arise between institutional clients and land users. I mean, Marina raises one there about the term of the tenancy and longer term tree planting. That is a competitive tension. And so understanding why entities can or can't or are reluctant to do things is something that I found really important. So that's me.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's much appreciated. Could you say a bit more about the nature of glebe land? Guy said about Church Commissioners' holdings. Their agricultural land that they have is largely grade 1 to 3, and mostly they have whole holdings as part of their portfolio of different land. Glebe land is a bit different. Would you say a bit more about that?
No, it's a good point, and actually it's a unique strength, I think, of glebe land is that the Diocese of Exeter, for example, is let's say just under 2,000 acres, but that is spread across all of Devon, and it is split across potentially 200 separate individual parcels of land, no larger probably than about 80 acres. The historical use of the glebe was to directly support the clergy in their locality. So it was a piece of land upon which the clergy, the local vicar, could grow crops or rent it out and receive an income. And so because of that geographical spread, and because of that geographical centering on small towns and villages, and because of how things have developed often around these glebes, they can be often incredibly useful ways for a local community to make use of land in a quite a high impact way. And the Apricot Centre is an interesting one because they make use originally of their land that wasn't in the glebe in an incredibly intensive but sustainable way. And that was quite a key factor or part of the learning that we wanted to try and get the other glebe tenants to take on board, is that a 2-acre site adjacent to a small local village can actually provide a sustainable income for a person, can sequester carbon, can be used sustainably, and can have a much wider community impact than just 2 acres if it was farmed conventionally could.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's very helpful. I'm going to move on now to Reverend Jonathan. As I mentioned, Reverend Jonathan is the rector in Winchelsea. I believe it's the rector, isn't it, Jonathan?
Yes, it is.
I mention that because, as far as my understanding goes, difference between a rector and a vicar is the rector had the living of the benefice or the parish, whereas the vicar received his income vicariously via the bishop, if memory serves. So there is a connection to church land in the sense that your title comes from you had the living of the church lands associated with Winchelsea. But at the moment, all the lands are managed by the diocese now.
Indeed, and well, yes, it would be quite nice to manage the glebe and dredge ponds for tench like Parson Woodford and all those sorts of things, but we don't do that anymore.
If you want,
yeah.
yes, please carry on and tell us.
So I'm well, there's some photographs here of Winchelsea. I have to say I'm not really an expert in anything. I'm a rector, as Mark has said. I've been fascinated by what we've heard so far, but I think and I was thinking about this, I mean, I think if one's absolutely honest, what we're trying to do in Winchelsea, which is in our churchyard, I don't think it was initially just to think about biodiversity. We're proud of a population of swifts that return here every year. We've got National Trust office nearby, which is very involved in the community, and indeed it's got a local project really to manage the land for wildlife rather than just managing it, letting it out. And I think because of those connections, and we wanted to make something of the churchyard, and we realized that the swift population would benefit from extra insect life. And so we devised a plan to have some wildflower circles. And I think, so we were very fortunate to have someone make quite a generous donation towards this. And I think one of the things that I learned after coming here was that attempts had been made to sort of make the churchyard a bit wilder because that helped save money on grass cutting in the past, but they'd been quite random. They just sort of left areas without cutting them. They hadn't discussed it properly and gone through the PCC, and this wasn't a great success and it wasn't very popular. So we were very keen to have a plan. We set up a churchyard subcommittee, and then we discussed what we might do, put that to the PCC so that if there were issues in the future from parishioners, they could be dealt with. And I think one of the things that's important and is context. And as Mark said, he came and spoke to us here a few weeks ago. And of course, each churchyard is very different in its context. And ours is very specific in that we're very central to the community. In that little image in the bottom right there, you can just see a rather small but overall image of our churchyard, which is square right in the centre of the town. And because of that, people use it, thank you, as a sort of thoroughfare. And it's considered really as a de facto village green in a way. So it isn't a little churchyard that's tucked away. And to just let it sort of wild would not be possible or appropriate or popular. And in fact, you can see there in that photograph, those three areas here, which I think this must have been done early in the spring. These are what we've created as our wildflower circles. So we haven't just let things develop. We've managed them. We've stripped the ground back. We've sown wildflower seeds, and of course, one of the most important one of those is the yellow rattle, which is doing really well. This year we had our flower festival, which meant that we had visitors. The local schools came, looked at the flower circles, looked at the insect life, and engaged in that way. We did, as I say, on the yellow rattle, we had one parishioner who's lived in the parish for over 80 years and farmed as a farm labourer most of that time. And to begin with, he was very anti-yellow rattle because he'd spent most of his life trying to suppress it. And of course, it's useful because it stops the growth of grass, which then stifles the wildflowers. So we did put some effort into stripping the ground and to sowing it. And we happen to be lucky enough to have someone who used to work at Kew, and we've actually got this year we've got an orchid which has taken. So we've sowed and planted it, and then in the autumn we will strip that down hard again. And what we hope to do is to develop the area. When Mark came to talk to us, he talked very much about having a management plan. And as you can see, this is quite a modest start. We believe that we could extend this to much bigger areas of the churchyard. We need to remember what we're for and that we're a burial ground. We need to make it look as if it's meant. But we think by doing that, we can reduce costs. And certainly the community are now really interested and engaged by this. So there's been that other effect of not just managing biodiversity. We've got people coming in. We've got people who aren't churchgoers helping in the autumn prepare the ground. The actual cost of all this hasn't been very great. And I'm pleased to say we also worked with, well, we've had the Sussex Wildlife Trust came, and they were terribly excited because they found a rare wax cap, which we didn't know about. But certainly all that has drawn people in, and we hope that we can build on that. There's the wax cap, and in a recent out of that has also sprung the establishment of something calling itself Winchelsea Wildlife, which is also working quite closely with the National Trust. I mean, none of this was really planned. But Winchelsea Wildlife did their little bee audit about a week ago, and I'm very pleased to report that the bee density and species found in the churchyard was higher than anywhere else in the town in Garden. So perhaps it's having a small impact. It's helping our swifts. It's helping us educate. It's drawing people in. I hope it will reduce costs, and it's fun. Having said that, it struck me as reflecting, we had just celebrated Trinity Sunday, where, you know, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are always present at the same time. And I think this is a little bit like that with this. We didn't set out for biodiversity, but biodiversity and community and engagement somehow all come together in that way. So I think that's a very general overview of our context, what we've tried to do, and I hope that's sufficient, Mark. If there's anything else you think I should add.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Just one question. You mentioned about the engagement, the community is really getting involved in what's going on. How did you go about communicating with your community about your activities with the churchyard?
Well, that's a good question. I think we have obviously a certain amount goes through the PCC. A certain amount is because they walk through the churchyard, so they can see these circles. We have had we've got a pretty good digital magazine which is reporting on that as well. We have my wife, who's got involved in Winchelsea Wildlife, gave a talk to what we call our Second Wednesday Club. So that was about the broader thing, not just the churchyard, but talking about the churchyard too. So and we've got a website. I mean, again, we probably could do more about communicating, but it's certainly beginning to engage people, and I think I'm always very nervous about doing things that people don't support, and it would be fair to say that not everyone really wants to see a much enlarged area that's managed really and is wilded, and there's the other issue, of course, with the grass cutting. You know, the grass cutting is somebody's livelihood, so we've got to be careful about that. So it's balancing all these things, but I think having good feedback and having the community on side is definitely helping. But we use an Instagram page, but I have to say I don't really engage much in that, but my wife's done quite a lot on that.
Thank you for that. That's brilliant. Can I just remind everyone who's a participant in this webinar, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. and we'll try to answer them in the remaining time that we have. We've had a few questions come in, and I'm going to see if we can respond to those now. The first ones are for Guy. Guy, could you possibly give us a bit more about the portfolio when it says about the area's uses included within it? So in other words, as well as sort of it being prime agricultural land, what actually goes on the prime agricultural land?
Yes, sorry, is it a question from Hamish Lees on the area's uses in the strategic portfolio, is it? Sorry. So essentially, once land gets allocated for either housing or employment or another use, it then falls within the strategic portfolio, and we continue to manage it, but it's then being sort of built, is being sort of going through the planning process for housing or whatever else development process, development is needed on that said site. And that's the difference between the strategic portfolio and the farmland portfolio, but both are managed by ourselves. And then when planning is either achieved, there is various sales processes which are undertaken. Then on the river pollution, yes, so we have the specific site is Bartonshire Meadows in Hereford, which abuts the River Wye. That was 100 acres, and that's undergoing a arable reversion to floodland meadows, and we've got a tenancy in place with the Hereford Wildlife Trust, and we're working close with them. On the other river projects, we are engaging with tenants to get an understanding whether there is wider field margins which can be achieved along the rivers, and whether that can be extended, and whether there's any riparian planting. They are done on a case-by-case basis through us as asset managers and through our agents, and they're very site specific. But those conversations and through those non-agenda meetings, we sort of bring tenants together and have those conversations. So that is very much in the process of taking place. And we have, sorry, just finally on the communion forest, we are looking at registering a couple of sites where we have reverted land. I mean, the site in Bartonshire Meadows is a potential one which we might look at, but we haven't actually got fully confirmation from the Wildlife Trust. But we are also looking elsewhere where there is woodland being grown and whether they can be registered. At this stage, there is, within our timberland portfolio, is predominantly focused outside of England, which I think is as a parameter for the communion forest. But we are looking at where there is small on-farm woodland, where they can be registered and where there is public access. So that's something that we are looking across the portfolio at.
Thank you, Guy. I know that various dioceses are looking at what they can do as well with the land holdings that they've got, and I will see if I can find out more about that as well. If for later on, we'll try and post something up about that.
Can I just jump in, Mark? Because it struck me on this. We've got a bit of glebe land in one of my churches, which is really just a problem. I mean, it may be that it's that sort of land, but it strikes me that this must be the case in many other places, that maybe the conversation should be had with the diocese and say, hang on, could we, is there anything better we can do with this? It may be that it is the sort of parcel of land that is a problem, but I just sort of throw that in really, and it would be useful to have guidance, and I suspect others would be thinking the same thing.
The wonderful advert you've just been. Thank you ever so much, Jonathan, because we've just published some guidance on diocese and glebe land, which I'll pop a link to in the chat shortly. That is aimed to be at something which is helping the conversation between the DUS and land managers, those with interest in promoting climate and sustainability on glebe land, about approaches that could be taken in a constructive way, and to identify those particular pieces of land, just as you're saying, that might have potential for trees or for managing for climate or for managing for biodiversity net gain as part of all of the glebe land that the diocese holds. I'll pop the link into the chat shortly, but as we're on that point, I'm wondering if both Jeremy and Marina want to comment on the question from Kate about approaching a diocese about an idea to do with managing land sustainably with climate and biodiversity in mind, about the best way to do it and the likely reaction they're going to have.
Do you want me to start, Marina, or do you want to take it?
No, why don't you start and then I'll join in with my experience.
I suppose if we use the Apricot Centre as a case study here, the diocese had a wish to engage with people like the Apricot Centre or users like the Apricot Centre to find a solution to a problem, which was how can we use land in a sustainable way, and how can we kind of measure the additionality, this kind of sequestration that was being generated. And in terms of how that approach would be received, I mean, incredibly positively in this instance. And I think in terms of barriers to entry or barriers to why shouldn't this happen elsewhere, the quality of Marina's approach, expression of interest was fantastic. And it came from an organization that was doing it already next door. So in terms of providing reassurance as to, I suppose, stepping off the diving board here into something that's fairly new, quite a lot of that was provided. I think talking to my experience of diocese previously was that they'd be incredibly open and positive to an approach from any similar entity like the Apricot Centre for a kind of use of a similar nature. I wouldn't see why not.
Yeah, and from my point of view, I mean, it was I would say there was a little bit of serendipity involved in that. Obviously, we were next door to these glebe lands and watching them kind of really run off into the road every winter and flood the road so nobody could go down the lane, and you could just see the soil running through the gates, and you know, just thinking, oh my goodness, what a mess, really. Sorry to say that, but and my friend and colleague happened to be in Exeter when there was a conference about the Church's approach to climate change and nature conservation, and then came back, and we were a friend and a neighbour, and we were having a meeting. He said, Marina, you should, you know, we did our impact assessment for our land trust, and he said you should write to the church to ask if you can take on those glebe lands and show them how it's done. Because we had such a because he just listened to the church saying how they wanted to be carbon net zero and support biodiversity. So because we'd just done this incredible impact assessment, he said you should do that. It was right in the middle of the pandemic. I was very stressed because our sales had quadrupled, and I said, well, I just don't have capacity, but why don't you write to them on our behalf? So he did with my husband, who's also a director here, and clearly it was a very well laid out letter, because it landed very well, I understand. And then a couple of years later, I think it was about a year and a half later, Jeremy turned up. So it was like I didn't even know that you could write to the church to say, you know, could I take on land? So I think it's just because my friend was a bit more proactive, or, you know, cheeky. I don't know what the expression is, but basically, if you see a bit of land and you'd like to take it on, then maybe the thing to do is just to write a letter saying what you would like to do. But I've been interestingly, I've been training a young man from Cornwall, from Penryn, near Falmouth, right next to the university campus. And they've started a community market garden there, also right next to on glebe lands. And I think it was a similar thing that they just wrote, could we take it on? And we're slightly surprised by the answer. So I think there's a feeling of like we didn't know quite who to write to, and we didn't know who managed the land. So the church and now Savills have approached us a few times to say other little pockets of glebe land have come up, and did we know anyone who would like to take it on? So I think as the story comes out, more people will feel, you know, empowered, let's say, to write and just say, I've got a project in mind. But my suggestion, it might be if you had a link with an address on a website to say, please present your suggestion like this. I think if you opened those gates, I think you would have an avalanche of especially young regenerative farmers applying to take on bits of land. That, because we're training up hundreds. Our application rate is 200 plus people per 20 places. So there's a huge amount of young people out there desperate for these little bits of land.
Thank you ever so much for that. I hope that it's answered a couple of questions that we've had about how to approach dioceses about glebe land. I think the point that both Guy and Jeremy made about peer-to-peer learning also applies for dioceses, and therefore dioceses learn from one another about how to handle approaches about management of glebe land, for example. So I think that having conversations using the example that you've given and shown is a good way to begin conversations and to start constructively building on the relationship between those who manage the land, those who have ideas about how the land could be managed, to bring forward something which is actually beneficial to both. I'm going to move on with the questions. We're going to run slightly over one, which I hope is all right for those on who have joined us, just to cover a few more of the questions. I think I'm going to add together some of the questions about decisions on buying and selling land, to go back to Guy and Jeremy, and say a bit more about the sort of, for example, with the church commissioners, where I know that you both will on occasion, I know that the church commissioners will on occasion dispose of land, but also purchase new land as well. When those sort of decisions are having to be made, what sort of criteria, Guy, do the commissioners use to sort of assess the land that they're going to deal with? And when it comes to it, Jeremy, when dioceses are looking at their glebe land as well, what sort of the considerations that they have to make in terms of what decisions they make about keeping it, selling it, or what they do with it?
Yep. So from a Church Commissioners for England point of view, the portfolio is very much actively managed. So we are buying and selling pretty regularly. It's all done on a case-by-case basis, and we'll be assessing the potential. So we've got a term which we use as higher, better uses. So is there any opportunity for renewables, or is there sort of development potential, or is there anything else which might be of interest? And then we assess that and see if that land might have a sort of alternative use. And equally, from a selling point of view, it's done on a case by case, and if it's surplus to requirements and if it's poor performing asset, then that might be to present an opportunity for a sale. There is no real geographical sort of area which we're particularly focused on. I mean, in a similar vein, my timberland colleagues, they're sort of looking at land which could be planted and things like that, but they'll have their own credentials for land which they choose.
Thank you, Guy. Jeremy, if you would give us something on the sort of decision-making process that goes on with dioceses as well, it'd be very helpful.
It would be entirely similar. Well, entirely similar. It'd be largely broadly similar to the church commissioners and Guy. Will be on a case-by-case basis, although obviously the overall portfolio is much smaller. The dioceses won't be purchasing land, but they may dispose of assets, land, over time. It's interesting that kind of Guy makes a point about the performance of the asset, because actually, if you kind of pull back from the personal use of the land and the effect, you look at it financially, you think, well, there's an acre of land that's not producing a huge amount of income. And actually, that's where these alternative uses, particularly kind of thinking market garden, where the intensity of use can be much higher and have a much wider benefit. I think that's something that's quite useful to understand in terms of the, I suppose, should an asset be disposed of because it's providing better income and has a kind of broader, wider use. But no, it is generally a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Jeremy. Just time for one more quick question, hopefully, because I think I've seen the answer to this, but this is probably best directed at Guy. Pre-letting assessments for potential new tenants.
Yep. So this is a sort of new format which we're implementing, and it's essentially identifying areas which might not be sort of used for a conventional farming and might sort of identify an area where we could do a pond creation, some small woodland areas, or areas which are suitable for environmental schemes. We'll then provide a format for it, and then when we take it to the market, we'll be encouraging tenants to sort of, this is the parameter of the letting and this is what we'd like to see the land go into. This will be done either through a memorandum of understanding or a side letter, or within the special conditions within the farm business tenancy. But also during that sort of letting process, we're very keen on encouraging our tenants, the tenants, to come forward to be regenerative and to have that sort of element to their farming. So we're looking for sustainable farmers to come forward through the tender process, and that will be then form part of that through the pre-letting environmental assessment as well.
Thank you, Guy. I believe there's a question in the chat as well as in the Q&As looking at the balance between rewilding and this is with more small scale, but to do with churchyards. So this is directed at Jonathan. How do you balance the rewilding aspect and the need to have a public space, as well as the principal reason for a churchyard being there, which is to provide a burial space for those who have died within the parish?
Well, I think the answer to that is we're sort of trying to work it out, really. But I think, as I suggested when I spoke, when you came to talk to us, you did talk about the need for a management plan. And we feel that we've got enough space that we can easily put aside an area which can be used for burials. We've got our individual areas for interment of ashes anyway. If necessary, those can be rotated. But I think the important thing is and this is what we're hoping to do this year, because one of the things we do is we make an appeal for grass cutting in the spring. So what we don't want to do is make an appeal for people to help us with the grass cutting and then not cut the grass. We need to have decided what we're going to do, make sure they understand that, so that they're not annoyed that they've donated to something. So what we're hoping to do is to have a management plan for our churchyard, which I hope next year will include some larger areas that we will manage. We want to introduce some more wildflower areas where we're sowing wildflower seeds and developing it in that way. And that once we've got that approved by the PCC, when we go in the spring for an appeal, we can explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. But I think the key thing is, as you said, it's having a plan, getting people to agree it. Above all, I think getting the PCC to agree it, so that if there are then voices that say, why are you doing this? Which, to be honest, we haven't had. But if there are, you can say, well, it was agreed by the meeting. It's not just somebody's whim. And that we can move forward in that way. So, it is a balance. And of course, obviously, the aspect of burial is important. But I think the aspect of a place which engages the children, which engages visitors, and it's actually a joy to look at, is desirable. But it is a question, as I say, of making sure we're managing expectations, and we aren't just, a small group of people aren't just having a go.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. I'm going to hand back to Harriet to close us in a moment. But before I do so, I just want to say a very big thank you to all of our panelists, to Guy, to Jeremy, to Marina, and to Reverend Jonathan, to say thank you for giving up your time and for coming out to us and sharing your expertise with us. It's been really great to hear from you. Thank you for answering the questions. It will be possible to put further questions to us. You can either, if people have put into the chat their emails, you're welcome to contact them directly, or you can contact us at the Church of England's Environment team, and we'll be able to put questions to any of the panelists on your behalf. So I'm going to hand back to Harriet and to close our webinar. So thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Mark. I thought that was really fascinating. Fantastic to hear all the different sides. We deal solely with burial grounds, with churchyards, and so it's really interesting to be given that slightly wider perspective. I just want to say, Reverend Meyer, I just quickly looked up your churchyard on the Beautiful Burial Ground portal within the NBN, which is something Caring for God's Sake has set up with an awful lot of help from the Church of England. And you don't just have one rare fungi, you've got 101 grassland fungi species there.
Oh, well,
You've got one heck of a site. Can I say, don't worry too much about planting wildflowers. You've got ancient meadow, you've got a magnificent site, and it absolutely needs a management plan, but it does not need rewilding. It's probably lovely as it is. But yes, so that was very interesting to have a quick look. So yeah, I'm going to just close the session now. Thank you all once again for your contributions, obviously from the panel and from Mark, and of course to the questions. And we will be sending out an email with those links and things like that people have mentioned. And if the panelists could email any links to us, we'll get them onto that email. And this has been recorded, and the recording will be available for other people as well. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you tomorrow.